President,
Senator from Delaware.
while he's still on the floor, I want to thank my friend and colleague. He and I came together to the House of Representatives a million years ago. We were part of the class of 1982, a huge class, over 80 Democrats and Republicans. It's been a joy to serve with him, and I especially am proud of him and the words that he has just said here today. Healing words, uniting words, and we're grateful for his leadership. Mr. President and colleagues, the Senate is now considering the substitute amendment to H.R. 3684, the INVEST Act. And I rise today to urge our colleagues to join Senator Capito, sitting to my right, and me in debating the legislation, offering improvements where needed to it, and then voting for its adoption. In February of this year, at my encouragement, President Biden invited Senator Capito, Senators Cardin, Inhofe, and me, all senior members of the Senate Committee on Environmental and Public Works, Environment and Public Works over to the White House right after he was inaugurated president to discuss the need to make bold investments in our nation's crumbling infrastructure. Sitting in the Oval Office that day, as I'm sure the ranking member of our committee remembers, we were joined in person by the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, and we were joined virtually by Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. I still want to call him Mayor Pete, but he's actually turned out to be a pretty darn good Secretary of Transportation as well. Because of the our committee's longstanding tradition of bipartisan work on infrastructure, my colleagues and I already knew as we headed into that White House meeting that our nation had fallen woefully short in maintaining and developing the critical infrastructure that supports us, our families, and our economy. But don't take my word for it. Don't take my word for it. The American Society of Civil Engineers 2021 report card for America's infrastructure gave our nation's infrastructure an overall grade of C-. In recent years, that rating has been as low as D+, D-. Still, a C- is nothing to brag about. Rather, it's a wake-up call to get our act together at a time, if you will, to move it on up. Move it on up. And that's what our new president called on us to do that day in order to help America move on up and move ahead. Without casting aspersions or affixing blame, he made it clear that America hadn't been getting the job done on this front for years, and that by working together, we could do something about it while creating millions of new jobs, a lot of them without college degrees at the same time. He asked us, leaders, on the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, he helped us to help jumpstart the effort to getting to work on crafting and reporting to the full Senate surface transportation legislation. And along with the legislation to repair and upgrade drinking water and water sanitation infrastructure as soon as we could. Working together with all 20 members of the Environment and Public Works Committee, 10 Democrats, 10 Republicans, that's exactly what we did in record time and with record levels, historic levels of investment. After soliciting input, I'm sure my colleague from West Virginia recalls, after soliciting input from all 50 states, we crafted and then unanimously reported our water infrastructure bill out of committee to the full Senate, unanimously. There it was debated, amended, and adopted by a vote of 89 to 2. 89 to 2. You don't hear that every day. On April 29, 2021. And with that behind us, we turned our attention to surface transportation legislation, roads, highways, bridges, climate, and unanimously reported our surface transportation bill to the full Senate by memorial day, the fastest the committee has ever acted, I'm told, on such legislation. I thank Senator Capito so many times she's probably getting sick of it, but I want to thank her again, and I want to thank every member of our committee with whom we're privileged to serve on the Environment and Public Works Committee, along with the members of our staff, some of whom are gathered here today, for their remarkable work on these important bipartisan bills. Speaking of staff, I'm going to look over my shoulder. I see some of our team right behind me, and look over the other shoulder, I see some of our Republican staff over on the other side. But I would especially want to pause and just thank our Environmental Public Works Staff Director, Mary Frances Repko, our Chief Counsel, Greg Dotson, as well as Rebecca Higgins, who leads our transportation team, Kenneth Martin, and Jordan Baugh as well. And a special thank you to John Kane and Annie D'Amato, who ably led our efforts on water infrastructure, to Laura Haynes-Gillum, our lead on climate, and finally to my indefatigable Chief of Staff, Emily Spain. I practiced that word all night, the last night, to make sure I got it right. I also want to hasten to add that we couldn't get any of this done without Senator Capito and the strong bipartisan support we received from her, from the EPW Minority Staff Director. I see him sitting over there, Adam Tomlinson. Adam, thank you. And his hardworking team. I won't mention them all, but Murphy Barrett, affectionately known as Murphy Brown, and Travis Cohn and Jess Kramer were. You're expected chair of the Environment Public Works Committee, or the ranking member, to be proud of their committee's work, and we certainly are. But we aren't the only ones who have worked hard to write the legislation that's before us today, not by a long shot. And I want to commend the bipartisan work of the Commerce Committee and Energy and Natural Resources Committee, along with the efforts of the Banking Committee. Especially want to thank the bipartisan group we affectionately refer to, Senator Durbin already has, we affectionately refer to them at least most of the time as the G22, led by Rob Portman of Ohio and Kirsten Sinema of Arizona. I want to thank them and the other 20 senators, half Democrat, half Republican, for their Herculean efforts to make this compromise legislation a reality. Working not just with the folks here over in the House, but also at the White House as well, with the President, the President's team. There in the Navy, we have one of my favorite sayings in the Navy is Bravo Zula. And when somebody does extraordinary work, what we say is Bravo Zula. I would certainly say that on this occasion. Of course, we all recognize that infrastructure encompasses much more than water, roads, highways, and bridges. In truth, it touches on the jurisdictions of many of our committees. That's why the legislation we're considering today is extraordinary. It is a comprehensive infrastructure investment package that encompasses water, highways, roads, bridges, transit, rail, airport, ports, power systems, dams, broadband, cybersecurity, ecosystem restoration, and more, and more. I'd like to pause here for just a moment to remind all of us who serve in this body, along with the people that we are privileged to represent, that infrastructure is also intensely personal. And when it does not work, our people suffer. Their children suffer, and their livelihoods suffer. And we all know that those who suffer most are those who have been shortchanged by the patently inadequate investments we have made for too many years. In rural parts of southern Delaware, communities like Ellendale have struggled for years to find and afford safe alternatives to increasingly polluted drinking water wells. Ellendale is not alone. Across our country, hundreds, maybe thousands of communities struggle with access to clean water and wastewater treatment, including my native West Virginia, now represented by our colleagues Shelley Capito and Joe Manchin. Our communities across this country are torn asunder by too many places across this country, are torn asunder by highways that have divided and disrupted neighborhoods across our nation. In my hometown of Wilmington, Delaware, construction of I-95 literally tore communities apart, cutting off access to neighbors, parks, and economic opportunity. And we can begin to heal those wounds in places like Baltimore and Philadelphia as well. Heal those wounds with the projects we enable in this legislation. The truth be known, Mr. President, almost all of our colleagues have stories like this to share. Communities beset by raging wildfires fueled by climate change. Thousands of acres of farmland lost to flooding. More than a third of the crops in Iowa destroyed by hurricane-force winds last year. Kids without access to the internet for want of broadband access. And families struggling to deal with legacy pollutants in the land and water where they live. In the near future, Mr. President, I hope we'll take some time to celebrate the significant steps we are taking to rewrite these stories with this legislation before us. But I want to take a moment or two here today, if I may, to drill down on some of the most meaningful provisions reported unanimously out of our committee. Environment and Public Works Committee this year. And let's start with the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act of 2021. It's clear that the programs we have now, despite our best efforts, aren't sufficient to meet the needs of many of our communities, particularly those who simply can't afford to participate in the revolving loan programs of their states in order to upgrade increasingly inadequate drinking water and wastewater facilities. As our ranking member knows, so if communities borrow money out of these revolving funds, water funds, one for drinking water and one for sanitation, water sanitation, if communities borrow money, take money out of there, they're expected to pay them back, pay that money back. And there are, as we know, so a lot of communities that are just too impoverished to ever do that. And we decided not just to bemoan that, but to actually do something about it. And that's what we've done with this legislation, to provide them with the opportunity to receive a grant to clean up their water, their drinking water, and to deal with their wastewater. Millions of Americans are going to be able to do that, to deal with these challenges, and we are going to help it. This bipartisan legislation works to address this crisis by authorizing more than $55 billion for programs that will create jobs and make our communities healthier by building, repairing, upgrading, and modernizing our nation's aging drinking water and wastewater infrastructure systems. $55 billion. Here's how. First, the measure takes the historic step of reauthorizing the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund for the first time in 35 years. 35 years. And it does so while increasing funding levels for the first time since 1987. This legislation also reauthorizes the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, program whose authorization expires at the end of this year. You'll recall that this is the fund that helps to ensure that clean water flows from our faucets when we turn on the spigots. To help resolve an historic injustice in water infrastructure investment, more than 40% of this bill's investments are targeted to help disadvantaged communities. The bill appropriates $15 billion in new funding to replace lead service lines, and particularly for our country's rural areas, including native Alaskan villages, tribal communities, and low-income neighborhoods. Our bill invests another $1 billion in programs to connect households in drinking water and wastewater systems and services. And this legislation does far more than just fix what's broken. To borrow a phrase from our president, it truly does enable us to build back better by fortifying water infrastructure in the face of our new and worsening climate reality. Sadly, Mr. President, our future is one with more severe weather events like hurricanes, like floods, droughts, and bitterly cold weather. I wish it weren't true, but it is. It's a future with ever more people living on the front lines of sea level rise, like Louisiana, which on the average, if you can believe this, Louisiana loses a piece of land to the sea, roughly the size of a football field, every 100 minutes. Every 100 minutes. To that end, the bill before us provides a combined $500 million to make our water infrastructure system more resilient and more adaptable in the face of extreme weather events. And within that historic investment is a new $125 billion program, which will, for the first time, provide grants to communities seeking to fortify their wastewater systems against climate change's impact. This is not just a bill to spend and build, but legislation that will direct our agencies to build and spend more wisely. We know that investment in innovation, as envisioned in this bill before us, can have a profound impact on our economy, creating jobs and fostering growth for our entire community. We can, in short, seize the day in the face of so much adversity. Seize the day. Carpe diem. Or as we say in Delaware, Madam, Carper diem. It is fair to say there is also much we can and will do to invest in our nation's highways, roads, and bridges. Our Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act increases the baseline for funding our service transportation programs by more than a third to $303 billion over the next 5 years, $303 billion. On top of that, the legislation will invest over $60 billion of new funds for roads, bridges, and multimodal programs over these 5 years. This investment will repair and rebuild our roads and bridges with a new focus on climate change mitigation, resilience, equity, and safety for all users, including cyclists and pedestrians. Every day, motorists cross bridges in poor conditions in too many parts of our country 170 million times. Every day. Every day. 170 million times a day. Some 40% of the bridges in our country are in need of repair replacement, including nearly 500 bridges in Massachusetts, 3,000 in Pennsylvania, and God knows more in our states as well. At the current pace of investment in bridges, it could take nearly 40 years to tackle the current backlog of bridges in poor conditions. That's right, 40 years. That's why today we consider legislation to provide a $40 billion investment to address our dawning bridge repair backlog. Our legislation also includes, for the first time in a Senate reauthorization bill, climate title with provisions dedicated to curbing harmful greenhouse gas emissions, while ensuring the investments we make are more resilient to climate change, enhanced extreme weather events. Because like it or not, it's coming our way. As many of you know, the transportation sector is the largest source of carbon emissions in our nation, almost 30%, just from this one source, our cars, trucks, and vans. So if we want to save our planet, and we do, for our children and grandchildren, we have to tackle this major contributor to the climate crisis with a special zeal. The bill we marked up in our committee, Environment and Public Works Committee, this spring by, again, a 20-0 vote, put us on the right track, dedicating $18 billion toward reducing our carbon emissions and including $2.5 billion for building electric vehicle charging and hydrogen fueling stations on highways and in locations like schools, workplaces, parks, and public accessible areas for our communities. This bill also adds another $5 billion for EV charging and hydrogen fueling stations to help us transition to a zero-emission future. A lot of people have heard about and talked about charging stations, electric vehicle charging stations. Not so many people mention hydrogen. Hydrogen is a big part, going to play a major role in reducing our carbon emissions, and particularly with mid-sized trucks and larger trucks, but also when we talk about reducing carbon emissions in the industrial sector. So stay tuned. A lot to come on that front. The great thing about the hydrogen, clean hydrogen, especially in vehicles to propel them, hydrogen with the technology that we have today, it creates an emission from these vehicles, but it's water, H2O. I'm told it's water we can actually drink, so think of that. And we can also drive down emissions and curb pollution by supporting convenient, healthy alternatives to driving. Bicycling and walking are not only affordable modes of transportation, but healthy ones as well. An important consideration in a nation where all too many Americans are dying from medical conditions tied to obesity. Sadly, far too many Americans live in neighborhoods where there are no safe bike lanes and crosswalks. Tragically, in 2019 alone, over 7,000 pedestrians and bicyclists lost their lives in traffic accidents. Over 7,000 pedestrians. I would wager, Mr. President, that many members of this body actually knew one or more than one of those victims or their families personally. So I'm grateful that our bill works to address these needless deaths head on. The good question is how? And by providing a 70% increase in funding for programs that develop safe, accessible pedestrians and bicycle pathways across our nation, and by authorizing almost $17 billion in funding for highway safety improvements. I also want to note here some of the critical investments in infrastructure that are outside of the EPW committee jurisdiction and the important work that those committees did to bring this bill to the floor. First, a note of appreciation for the portion of this legislation that was authored by the Senate Commerce Committee, led by Senators Maria Cantwell and Roger Wicker. As one of the tens of thousands of Americans who commutes to work on the East Coast by taking Amtrak almost daily, I'm encouraged to see that this bill invests in our railway across our nation. This legislation not only provides $6 billion in grant to the Northeast Corridor to address Amtrak's deferred maintenance needs. It also provides another $16 billion for the Amtrak National Network, Amtrak's national network, and another $41 billion in grants to improve passenger rail performance and safety. I also want to applaud the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee and others, both on and off the committee, who worked tirelessly to advance robust funding for public transit infrastructure in order to make it possible for millions of people to get to work and home again every day. Transit and rail are both critical components of our climate change response, providing low and low-emission travel choices. This bill, our bill, reauthorizes and grows our transit programs while also providing more than $5 billion in grants for state and local agencies to purchase electric and low-emission transit buses. And our colleagues on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, led by Senators Manchin and Barrasso, crafted legislation that will help support and clean up our nation's energy infrastructure. Investments made in this bill will work to make our electric grid more reliable, more resilient, support families and businesses to become more energy efficient, while helping to clean up our nation's old and abandoned mines and wells that leak toxic pollution and methane emissions. The bill before us this week also includes investments in battery recycling and zero-emitting technologies, including a program much like one passed out of our EPW committee last year that supports our existing nuclear power fleet, which collectively produces, get this, half of our nation's carbon-free electricity. And while there's much to celebrate in this product of our bipartisan efforts, more work still needs to be done. Collectively, we've incorporated badly needed climate provisions in surface transportation, water, power, and a number of other infrastructure programs. But in truth, we have, in the words of Robert Frost, miles to go before we sleep. Miles to go before we sleep. And with the words of Robert Frost as a reminder, all of us who serve here together understand that every race won begins with a first step and ends with a final one. And with the enactment of this legislation, we'll be taking not one, but a number of important steps. In the days ahead, we'll move a good deal closer to the finish line in a race with a dangerously changing climate that we simply cannot afford to lose. That's why I'll be examining the budget resolution closely in the days ahead to ensure that we're devoting resources necessary to eliminate climate change and to put it on the run as we advance environmental justice. And I'd be remiss if I didn't add that we must not shy away in the days ahead from working hard to agree on how to honestly and thoughtfully pay for the investments that need to be made. In the words, my colleague from West Virginia, in the words of a former state treasurer of a small state on the East Coast who now serves in this body, things worth having or worth paying for. But the key mission of this day is that we've pushed through earnest disagreements, varying priorities, much headache and heartache to achieve a truly singular success in taking on a number of major infrastructure challenges facing our nation. We have elected to work together to address the obvious, to repair and upgrade much of our nation's infrastructure in order to better position America to succeed in an ever more competitive global economy and to survive in an ever more dangerous world due to climate crisis. Senator Capito and I've served together on this committee for a number of years, and she succeeds John Barrasso, who for a number of years was the chair and I was the ranking member. I'll never forget, and you probably won't either, Senator, you probably won't, we won't forget the words of a fellow named Rob Wallace, who's actually from, also from Wyoming, friend of Senator Barrasso, and who was nominated to be, I think, the Assistant Secretary for the Interior, focused on, among other things, national parks, wildlife refuges, fish and wildlife. I'll never forget what he said in his confirmation hearings. He commented on the history of the tradition of our committee is one where we actually work together, sort of like each other. Even though we don't always agree on the issues, we work to get things done. And he said these words, he said, that bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. That's what he said. Bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. I thought at the time, boy, he really nailed it. And I hope with this legislation, we will nail it too, because a lot of Americans are counting us to do just that. With that, I'm happy to yield the floor again to I'm tempted to call her a wing woman. She calls me her wing man. But my colleague and friend, the ranking member of this committee, and her staff, who've been just great to work with. Thank you. And you.